What's up everyone, my name is Mark Hawk, and today we're going to start wrapping up one of the most difficult, one of the most time-consuming and expensive and problematic side-by-side comparisons I've sort of ever taken on. We're going to put up the GoPro Hero4 Black edition running its latest 3.0 firmware up against Sony's X1000V running the latest 1.0 firmware against the DJI OSMO running the beta firmware of 1.5.184. Now the reason why we're using a beta firmware for the OSMO is because it resolved a bunch of issues we were having early on, but it is going to introduce this sort of rolling gimbal issue throughout the video. It's a little problematic, but we do a lot to work around it. I'll be going over firmware and other updates in later sections, speaking of which you can use any of these quick links to jump to the section you're most interested in. Otherwise, sit back and we'll start playing them all in just a second. Now, I usually save this for the end, but I feel like this video is going to go a little bit long. Anything we talk about or reference will be put in the more information section below this video, so you can check out those helpful links there. And also, Mark Hawk Cam is pretty much run primarily out of pocket. We don't get a lot of review units, so any money you can donate using patreon.com or Google Wallet goes a long way into supporting Mark Hawk Cam, and it makes endeavors like this much easier on me. So with that out of the way, let's get to it. Now we're going to cover all three of these cameras at a bunch of different locations, at a bunch of different settings. We'll probably answer most of the questions you have. If you do have questions though, check out the upper part of your screen here. When we're in this sort of 3-camera format, we're going to have a ton of information on what's going on with each camera at any time. Now throughout the video, we're going to go in the same sort of format where we're going to go full screen, and you'll see the name of the camera in the lower left, and they'll also go in the same order throughout the duration. So it'll go GoPro, Sony, and then DJI OSMO, and then before you know it, you'll probably know what's on screen without having to look at the stats. Now all three of these cameras, again, we're bringing them to a bunch of different locations. Things like this valley setting is really great because not only do we have a ton of different contrasts, we have a large focal distance. You can just see how the X1000V keeps everything really sharp in focus, especially the further we're traveled away. The GoPro Hero4 Black, if you kind of look in that lower left-hand corner, you'll see some shrubs and bushes. It does a really good job of keeping those in focus as well. The X1000V has a really good, cooler, crisp sort of color profile, while the GoPro Hero4 Black and Osmo have a more neutral sort of setting. Check out the sky. You'll notice how on the Black it's a little more muted. On the Osmo, it's somewhere in between those, and both of these cameras end up feeling a little muddy compared to the X1000V. Now the Hero4 Black Sharpness definitely has improved since when we checked it out earlier in 2015, but it's still nowhere near as sharp as the X1000V. And just to reiterate real quick, again, we're going to be doing the same format every time we introduce a new shot, and we have a ton of information above each video clip when we're in this sort of format. Now, the DJI OSMO might feel a little more zoomed in compared to the Sony or the GoPro, and that's because its field of view is much narrower. It's actually 94-degree field of view. So you'll notice with the Hero4 Black, we're a lot wider here, and then with the Sony X1000V, we get a lot more on the left and the right side of the screen. And with the Osmo, you're going to notice we're much more zoomed in. Now, that narrower field of view allows us to have less lens distortion on the left and right side of the screen, but it also makes we have to be a little bit further away from our subject. The X1000V has a super wide field of view lens, and it introduces a ton of lens distortion as we get further away from the center of the image in a sort of circle pattern. The bigger that circle gets, the more intense the lens distortion gets on the X1000V. The GoPro Hero4 Black does have lens distortion, but it's more towards the corners. If you think of a sort of a rectangle just sort of growing up and down, the closer we get to those corners, the more the lens distortion happens on the GoPro Hero4 Black. But we'll get more into field of view stuff later on. Now the Hero4 Black has a tendency to feel almost cinematic in a way. It has a sort of softness to it that when we're in a wide field of view can feel very nice and gentle. The Sony X1000V though, if you're going to notice here, it just pops out with a lot of color. Those whites come out, we have a ton of detail. We're a little bit brighter, and it's a really nice appealing color profile. The Osmo can feel a little bit muddy, especially in the warmer colors of the bushes. They kind of come together. But if you compare that, we have the Hero4 Black on the left. All those bushes feel a little bit soft, but they feel clean. While the DJI Osmo on the right, we have a lot more detail there, similar to the X1000V, but it feels a little bit muddy. Now, Sony's color profile is really nice. It just has a really nice pop to the whites. It has a really nice crisp to the blacks. And it just makes everything feel very cool. It has a very cool color profile. While the Hero4 Black and the Osmo definitely have a warmer profile and a little more muted. And I would really like to see the Hero4 Black, whenever it does its next update, maybe consider introducing a more cooler, more saturated, more contrasty, poppy color profile, and maybe not have it be its default option, but at least give sort of viewers a little bit something to select to. Now the reason why those muted colors are somewhat beneficial is scenes like this. If you look at the Hero4 Black, we have a lot lot of information in sort of the branch areas, the sort of shadows on the left. When we switch over to the X1000V, if you look on the right in that gate area, a lot of those blacks are crunched. So if we try and manipulate those colors, it's going to be a little weird. And again, the Osmo is somewhere in between there. But all three do a really good job of just showing off that sort of nice atmospheric smoke. But you can see a lot of it getting lost in the center of the screen on the X1000V. Just sort of, we're crunching the white and the black values to get us that really nice bright poppiness. Some of that finer detail can sometimes get lost. Now, as you see us zoom through these images, we're not going above 100%. Since we are filming at 4K, when we appear to be at 100% screen real estate, we're actually only at about 50% of the plate. And right now, what appears to be about 200% is actually 100% of 4K. So we're not rasterizing or distorting the plate in any way. It's just a really good way to sort of zoom in and show you things like the differences in branch detail, things that might get lost when we're at a smaller scale, when all you'll really see is color differences instead of finer detail differences. So when we're not facing into the sun and we don't have a really bright sort of light source in the background, all three of these cameras do a really good job of getting really rich blacks and really nice color. The Osmo in this scenario just makes the background look really nice. This is a day after it rained in Canyon Country. That's basically just north of Los Angeles. And everything looks really nice and really colorful in the DJI Osmo. And you'll see it here. And also notice how there's no real lens distortion, how everything's really level. The DJI Osmo gimbal is really good, especially after the newest update. Again, ours is continuously rolling through the shot, but I don't think it takes away and just basically taking in some of these shots and looking at the finer detail and things like bushes and that. Now, all three of these cameras will be better in some scenarios than compared to the others, and it's really about taking what these cameras are, sort of what their strengths are, and applying it to what you plan on using the camera for. Now, one of the ways we can really focus in on this is by looking at things like sharpness and clarity over just focusing on color. And while color is super important when making an action camera purchase, you don't want to just focus on that and get a camera that looks good, but then when you actually look at it at full screen, all the edges are gross or muddy or grainy. Now, all three of these cameras basically have a slight different sort of clarity and sharpness. The Hero4 Black is a little bit softer. Its edges are much softer roll-off, which makes things like color correction in post a little easier. The X1000V definitely has a really nice punch, which means we don't really need to do as much in post-production, but we're also limited if we wanted to. And when it's not pointed at a really bright source, the Osmo does a really good job of color, but when it has a bright light source and it has a ton of contrast, a lot of those darker areas can quickly go muddy, especially if there's a lot of vegetation. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at the difference between filming at higher frame rates. Now, the higher the frame rate we put out, the sort of more of a degradation in the footage we're going to see. So the way we're going to show this at first is we're going to look at all these cameras without any motion traveling through it. We're just going to see the differences as we switch from 30 to 60 to 120 frames a second. Focus on things like the dirt in the ground, and you're not going to need to rewind. We're going to sort of rapidly go through this in a little bit. But again, take a look at things like the ground or the bush and just watch as the sort of quality degrades when we switch from 30 frames a second to 60 frames a second. Now, switching to 60 frames a second isn't going to be a huge noticeable dip in quality, but if we start to switch to things like 120 frames a second, you'll notice in the Sony, the pixels start to look a little weird. The Hero4 Black is a little bit softer, and the DJI Osmo's field of view drops all the way to 47. And when we go to 240 frames a second, the Hero4 Black's field of view sort of joins to a 94-degree field of view, which is much more narrower. And again, as we sort of just cycle through these, you'll notice the X1000V, Sony's camera, basically stays the same, but the quality dip, especially when we hit 120 frames a second and 240 frames a second, is a bit more extreme. We see that really noticeable sort of rainbow quality pixel thing happen. Now, the reason why the sort of image is sort of shrinking, and that's because our field of view is changing so much that in order for me to keep everything sort of locked into the same spot, we're actually having to sort of scale down and twist the footage. We're not actually removing anything, but it basically just shows you how much field of view we're losing when we do this. It's also probably good to point out that the Osmo only does up to 120 frames per second, and when it is in slow motion mode, that field of view change and the sort of speed changes automatically within the camera. It automatically records it in that slow motion format. Now, Sony's line of camera gives you the option to do both. You can film it with sound at 240 or 120 frames per second, or you can have it automatically converted into 30 frames a second, but filming at 240 frames per second, which means we don't have to do any of this sort of post-production work to make this footage slow motion afterwards. The Hero4 Black doesn't give us the option to do automatic slow motion in camera, but it is recording all those high frame rates with audio, and then in post-production we can slow it down fairly easy with a number of free software, including GoPro Studio. Now here we're filming at 240 frames a second. This is basically 8 times slower than we would normally have. Now you see with the Osmo we're zoomed in at 120 frames per second. The GoPro Hero4 Black at 240 frames per second is a really soft and really narrow image, but the quality, other than being slightly soft, is still within a sort of gradual sort of margin of where it is, you know, at higher frame rates. While when if we go to 100% here, you can just really clearly see on the Hero4 Black how soft it is, on the Sony line of camera just how rainbowy and kind of like low res it almost looks like. And with the Osmo, you know, we're doing 120 frames a second, we're slowing it down to what we would have if we had 120 frames, 240 frames a second, and it's just really jittery. It's just missing a lot of in-between frames. Now we saw all the major color differences and quality differences when we're filming in direct sunlight. So now this challenge is how do all these cameras sort of handle themselves under varying lighting conditions. So low light, when there's a lot of weird different colors. Sony's line of camera has a backlit image sensor, which makes its sort of low light performance really well. However, remember how we talked about it having a much cooler color tone? It generally takes a lot of these scenes and drives them very blue. The Osmo, again, when it gets into those slightly darker areas, it can be very muddy, but we're noticing here that it's kind of flat. It's not as contrasty as we would have expected when we saw something like a bright sunlight maybe casting a huge shadow on the mountain like we saw earlier. It's very flat and sort of balanced all throughout. The Hero4 Black is not far off, and again, just the X1000V does a really good job with low light areas, but that white balance is just being pushed very white. Now, one of the cool aspects about the DJI Osmo is it's built to be really used with a smartphone at the same time you're using it. Now, you don't need to be using a smartphone or an iPad, anything that will connect with the DJI Go app. You don't need to do it other than the first time you boot it up to just sort of make the connection. But if we are using it in conjunction, we get a lot more options. So if we wanted to change things like the white balance and where our camera's automatically pulling those settings from, let's say we're looking at the sky here and we wanted it to actually pull off the ground to make the ground a little brighter, we can just tap on the screen and it'll automatically boost that up. Now the Sony X1000V again sort of persists with that sort of very blue-white balance. The Hero4 Black is introducing a ton of grain. We're filming with an ISO of 3200. That's different from when we filmed back in 2015 with the Hero4 Black, because ever since then it had the 3.0 firmware update, which added a bunch of different options. So normally we used to film at 1600, which was a little bit dark, and 6400 used to be way too bright and would introduce way too much grain. 3200 for me, I feel, is a good in-between. It's a little more grain than I would like, but it's a really good in-between sort of mode. Now the Sony line of camera has a backlit image sensor, which means its low light performance is probably going to be better than either of these cameras, and consistently better. Now here we have sort of a Christmas setting. Again, we were filming this back in November, December. It's now January. It's been a long time in the making trying to get this comparison. But check out the specular highlights on the sort of driveway. Look at the reflections, and look at the house across the street. Look at the light bulbs, the very warm light bulbs at the roof. Now with the Hero4 Black and the X1000V, you're going to notice these are a little more bloomed out. We don't see as much detail, but with the Osmo, you can definitely see those individual bulbs. And again, we're not seeing any of that lens distortion that we normally would. But look at the things like the reflection, the sort of sparkling that we have just from the rain hitting the driveway. It's a really cool image just because there's a lot of things to check out and see that are different. Just like the light bulb detail, how those animated lights are sort of crunching their values if they're doing anything sort of weird. And you notice our Osmo, our white balance is very blue here. Again, if we had it connected to a smartphone, we could tap somewhere on the screen and adjust it so it's warmer like the GoPro Hero4 Black. But again, we don't need to have it connected to the phone, and that's going to drain our battery pretty fast. But next, we're going to go over some of the audio. So I'm just going to calm down here, and you're going to hear some audio tests, and then I'll chime back in. Now all three of these cameras are on digital gimbals. They're not in cases, so all of this audio that you were hearing is raw and unobstructed. The DJI has its built-in gimbal. We can't really swap it out. We can swap out the cameras for higher fidelity cameras. The Sony X1000V is on a Fujitech gimbal, and it is the really only one I found that can be used with the X1000V. Even though it isn't designed to be compatible with it, it works well enough for this test. And the GoPro Hero4 Black, we're using a D-Shot gimbal. There's a ton of other gimbals, motorized gimbals for the GoPro Hero4 Black, but this is just the one we've used because it's a little more cost effective and I've liked its results. Now you notice the DJI Osmo had a really staticky microphone, and they've actually addressed this in newer firmware beta updates, but it's not much better. Basically, you now have the ability to mute the fan, but the audio quality is still pretty poor, but we can hook up external microphones to all three of these cameras. Now the X1000V is really good when you have sounds directed at it, has a really good dynamic range, and it's a stereo microphone. GoPro Hero4 Black is really good with picking up ambient noise, but it's not as sort of dynamic. And with the DJI OSMO, again, you're probably going to want to use an external microphone. I would say the internal microphone's only really good as reference, but now with the new muting sort of fan update, it makes it a little bit better, but you're sort of risking overheating your camera for doing prolonged stuff. So you'll notice here as we're doing this sort of gimbal test, look at things like lens distortion as we're going through here, sort of the image quality of when we're moving through images. The Osmo, this is one of the reasons why we updated, because before when we used to move the DJI Osmo through especially low light scenes, things would get very muddy and smudgy. You can definitely see that in our Osmo review, but with the newer firmware update, things are much nicer. And again, check out the white balance on the Osmo. It's really good. Having that tap screen feature would definitely help us here, but we're not actually using that. We're just sort of running up the stairs. Everything's running on auto. The Osmo's built-in gimbal, pretty much the thing you have to use with it, works really well. It's super simple. I can't stress enough that the Osmo's gimbal is one of the really nicer ones I've used for an action camera. The X1000V doesn't really have a gimbal. We are using this Fujitech one, but it didn't work out really well. It didn't really fit in it. It's designed more for the AS200, which is a smaller model of the camera. Now the Hero4 Black has a ton of motorized gimbal options. We're using the D-Shot. I really like it, other than the fact that updating and calibrating stuff was a bit of a nightmare, but if you don't like that one, there's like 9 or 10 other gimbals that you have to choose from. These other two cameras, you don't really get that luxury. Transition out of low light and gimbal and move into full-on nighttime mode. The Sony line of action cameras has always consistently been amazing in low light situations, and it's really the only action camera that I've ever had consistent results with really positive low light conditions, and that's because of its backlit image sensor. Now the Hero4 Black, since we last took a look at it, it's had a firmware update that allows us to change the ISO up to 3200. We can actually also do an ISO of 800, but 3200 was a nice sort of in-between zone for me because it allows us to get a little more detail without it becoming way overly grainy. 6400 grain just becomes a little too big, and I prefer to keep it at the GoPro color grade because we are doing a little bit of noise reduction. If we do change it to flat mode with ProTune turned on, we will introduce a lot more grain because the degrainer is turned off. Actually, I think now we have ProTune turned on, so degrainer would be off, so you might actually want to disable ProTune, switch it to ISO 3200 for the best results, because that's actually going to turn on the camera's internal degrain feature. Again, the X1000V just does a really great job of low light consistently. We get a lot of detail, and if we keep it around 30 frames per second, the in-camera software will actually bump up some of the darker white values to just show a little more detail. When we have things with a lot of minute detail at night here, you can see all three cameras do a really good job of picking it up. The X1000V just does a really good job of making this pop. Now this was for a Christmas lighting decoration contest in our neighborhood. Somehow this house-size Jack replica from the Nightmare Before Christmas only took second place, but it's a really good showcase to look at things like light bulbs and just see the differences in all three of these cameras. Again, you know, the Sony line of camera, we didn't really mention it before, and I feel bad about it, but it has a built-in digital image stabilizer, and if you're interested in the Sony line of cameras, go and watch any of our other comparisons with the GoPro cameras, because it acts like it almost has a gimbal, a motorized gimbal, but sort of a digital setting. It's going to reduce your field of view from 170 degrees to 120 degrees field of view, which is pretty good because it'll also help reduce some of that lens distortion. But it's a really awesome feature that we don't really showcase here because the whole time we have it on these motorized gimbals. Now, if you plan on using the Sony camera, the GoPro Hero camera for just sort of backup protection when you're riding your motorcycle, or a dash cam for when you're driving a car, take a look at the things like license plates. You're not going to get a ton of information from really most of these cameras when you are filming in a low light situation. And if you are, you're going to want to keep it around 30 frames per second. If you go to 24 frames per second, you're going to have way too much motion blur. If you go to 60 frames a second, you're actually cutting your shutter speed down, so you won't actually, you'll actually be reducing the amount of light the camera can collect. So if we were to switch this to 60 frames a second right now, you would see basically our brightness and our detail drop quite a bit. Not the clarity or anything like that, but we just wouldn't be able to make out subtle things like license plate numbers, the difference like that is very crucial when you're in an accident and you're looking for that information. So one of the things I've mentioned on and off is sort of crunching black and white values. Now, if you don't understand what that means, imagine you have a deck of 52 cards, and each one of those cards is a different shade of going from white to black. when we crunch those values, it's the equivalent of us taking away shades of white and black. So we have less sort of shades of white and black to go through, which means like when we get to a certain shade of white that the camera thinks it needs to represent, it's got less to choose from, but it's more poppier, it's brighter. Some of the issues that you'll run into though is like, let's say we have a really fine fall off. So let's say we're going from like one shade of blue to a lighter shade of blue. This is also really relevant when you're looking at the blue skies from the daylight footage. You'll notice some sort of weird artifacting or weird arcing lines. You'll see this a lot in the blue light bulb you see in the center of the screen. Because we don't have enough sort of gradual shades of blue, we end up having these really weird sharp sort of dancing edges, and you'll notice it a lot on the X1000V. We just sort of have this weird sort of flicker where it's like these little balls of squares. It's not as prevalent in the Sony OSMO, but look at other objects on the screen and you'll sort of notice these sort of fall-offs sort of happening. And you'll see it a lot, again, with sort of bright blue skies on all three of these cameras earlier on in the video. One of the big requests or questions I get when I'm recording these is why I exclusively start with 4K and maybe don't explore things like 1080p as much. And it's mainly because I want to showcase each camera in its best possible situation. So right now we're swapping between 4K and 1080p, and it's going to be really hard to notice the difference unless you're sort of framing A versus B. So as we're sort of going back and forth, take one area and just sort of focus on it. Things like that city in the background or the wheel well on the car or the skyscraper. You will notice at 4K there's a little bit more clarity, especially on things in the distance as we swap from 1080p to 4K. When we're 4K, things like the window lines will look a little sharper and we'll have a little more detail. Same with the wheel well underneath the car. Things just like white values and black values might get crunched down just a little bit more. Now, the reason why we keep showing these sort of three side by side is just so you can get an idea of what the color balance looks like. But again, we want to focus on things like those windows in the background or maybe that building on the bottom. Just see how the edges sort of change when we're going from 4K to 1080p. And it's going to be very hard again to see this without framing side by side. But basically you just have a little more fidelity in 4K. Now what we're going to do here is we're actually going to focus on color and color modes. So normally we start by filming with these cameras with their default color profile. For the Hero4 Black, that's the GoPro color grade. With the Sony, that's vivid. And for the DJI OSMO, it's actually considered none, but it has a multitude of different color profiles. And with Sony, vivid is now the default color profile. It's very different than it was if you're used to the AS20 and 30, but we've kind of covered that. Now, when we want to do post-production color correction, this is really important to film in flat or neutral color modes. With the Hero4 Black, that's called flat mode. With the X1000V, that's neutral. And with the DJI OSMO, that's called D-Log. Now, it's really hard to kind of describe why this is really important, but basically it goes back to that deck of 52 cards. When basically we film in flat mode, we have the full deck of 52 color cards and we have the full shades of colors. Now, the big benefit to this is if we want to do really nice color correction later on, like we're doing here now, I'm not a really good colorist, but we're just sort of going through some color profiles here. We get these nice rich colors. We have a wide variety of blacks and white values that we can crunch down and sort of customize. This is us creating our own color profile. So if we wanted something on the GoPro to be similar more to the Sony, we could do that ourselves. Now on the upper left, you see how the colors appear in flat mode, and in the bottom right, we're actually applying those same color settings with their more crunched down values. And you can kind of see like areas with that black value. When we switch over to our, again, it's really hard to explain. You might have to rewatch that part, and it's actually even harder to describe. Actually, you know what, maybe if we put 6 screens here, you'll actually be able to see the difference when we're going from different color grades. So we'll do that here in a second. So notice right now how you have all 3 of these at flat color mode. We have a wide range of blacks and whites. It looks washed out, but we want it to look washed out because now what we're going to go in and do is manipulate those colors ourselves. So on the top side of your screen, you're looking at the normal flat color mode with our color correction applied. And on the bottom, we have those default color corrections that we normally film every day with, now having those same colors applied. Look at some of those darker values when we apply some of those. They just look really sort of, you don't have as much control. And it's really hard to explain it, but if you want to have these really nice punched out color looks and you want to put in the time and effort, filming with those flat color modes and playing around with them is a really beneficial idea. All 3 cameras have it. And yeah, that's really what it comes down to. Now to briefly go over some of the field of view options, the GoPro Hero4 Black ships with 4 basic field of view options, and a 5th if you consider 1440p a different field of view option. So we have wide, which is what we've been looking at this whole time. You have medium, which is a 120 degree field of view. Now the Sony camera can mimic this if you turn on steady shot, but other than that, it doesn't really have field of view option controls. And then for the Hero4 Black, we have narrow, which actually brings it down to a more 94 degree field of view, gets rid of a lot of that lens distortion, but it's very zoomed in. You have to be very far away from your subject. Now the Hero4 Black also has super view mode, which allows us to basically take a little more top and bottom that we'd see in the 1440p and a little more on the left and the right, similar to the X1000V, and basically squishes that all into a 16:9 image. So it's basically like filming in a square in a 4:3 and then squishing the top and the bottom down to HD and then that extra information on the left and the right. Now the Osmo doesn't have any modes by default, but in a later firmware update they've actually already introduced a new field of view option mode, but I haven't been able to test it out yet, but it is coming. Now you probably wondered how we were going to do underwater tests with the DJI Osmo. The fact of the matter is we're not. It's not really waterproof, it's only splash proof, which means you could use it in the rain and not worry about really damaging it. But again, the DJI Osmo is not something that's going to be built to take a hell of a beating. Now the Sony X1000V is actually going to ship with a lens that has a bubble case on it. It's not really good for actually filming underwater. As you can see here, with the bubble lens, it's very blurry, and since we're underwater with 2 cameras only, we're going to switch to those so you can see them a little better. But with the X1000V, you really have to switch and upgrade to the dive case if you want to have really sharp underwater footage. The GoPro Hero4 Black does ship with a waterproof case with a flat lens on the front. If you want something that goes deeper than 40 meters, you're going to have to spend a little extra to get the 60-meter water dive case. Again, if you have the bubble lens with the Sony X1000V, it will protect it fairly deep, up to 10 meters. But again, it's not really meant for filming underwater. You get that flat lens and you can go up to 60 meters. Now the Sony X1000V also has the ability to switch to an underwater filming mode, which introduces a little more red. It's not a very great example when filming in the bathtub, but it does balance out your colors a little more, similar to if you had the Hero4 Black buying a red filter, but just not as strong. And you don't have to dish out the extra cash, so it kind of makes up for the dive case maybe. Now all 3 of these cameras actually do still photography in a bunch of different ways with a bunch of different options. Now if you want to check out any of these photos uncompressed without YouTube compression, you want to actually have them on your desktop, you can actually download these and a few video clips from the more information section below this video, and it'll have all these photos that we're showing now. Now the GoPro Hero4 Black is filming at 4000 by 3000, that's a 4:3 aspect ratio with a 12 megapixel image sensor. Now it takes its photos on a JPEG format, and one of the cool things is we have shutter control. Now the big benefit to this is if we have low light photos, the shutter will automatically adjust, that way it auto lifts everything up without making everything really grainy. If we want to do things like long exposure photography with a bunch of lights, we can do that. And we actually get full res time-lapse photos when we're going down the mountain and we want to grab a few stills, or if you want to do a time-lapse and color correct that later, we get the full benefit of the 4000 by 3000 12 megapixel image photo. Now with the Sony X1000V, we're going to have that same sort of vibrance and color quality pop, but with a much higher quality image. Now this is also taking photos on a JPEG quality, but unfortunately we don't have the shutter control that we have with the GoPro Hero4 Black, nor do we get the full quality time-lapse photos. We're actually getting stills basically taken from a video, so we won't really have any of that color control. Now the DJI Osmo does a really great job of taking low-res, just does a really good job of photography in general. The colors on this camera look really good. It's using a 16 megapixel image sensor at 4000 by 2250, that's a 16:9 aspect ratio. Now one of the big benefits to not only taking JPEG, but it also does Adobe DNG RAW photos, which is a much higher quality photo. And you can do this for all of your photos, whether you're doing full time-lapse. The only thing I think you can't do it in is, oh no, you totally can, I think. The built-in Panorama feature. Basically, your camera will swivel at the push of a button and automatically do a 180 or a 360 degree field of view photo and actually stitch it together for you. The only downside is it saves it into the phone, so it's basically a phone exclusive feature, and just getting it off the phone could be kind of cumbersome, and maybe, actually I guess maybe it wouldn't have the Adobe DNG there. Oh no, it saves all the raw photos, so you'd have to build it for yourself later, that's what it was. But it does a really good job of photography and just some of the values on how it basically goes from those nice warm hues on the clouds into the purples, just looks really good. Now the last thing I wanted to really discuss with these 3 cameras, and it's a really hard topic to discuss, but all these cameras are constantly changing through their firmware and their updates. Chances are by the time you see this video, both the GoPro and the DJI Osmo will have different features and different sort of settings based on their firmware updates, the GoPro's really been good at keeping up with adding new features and listening to the community and sort of responding to that. And there's a really good chance we'll probably see 1 or 2 more updates, especially with the sort of VR update coming from GoPro this 2016 in March or April. The DJI OSMO has also done a really good job of listening to its community. It has a sort of beta program that you can enlist in. You can basically give feedback and they'll actually respond to you verbally. The only disappointing thing is the Sony X1000V since launch has never had a firmware update, and there's been a really active community that have wanted some simple feature updates. They've wanted some things removed, some UI things adjusted, just some little things that would have made the overall user experience much better. We're going into its second year of its lifespan. Basically, it's been out for a year now, and we just really haven't heard anything from Sony, and it doesn't really sound like there's ever going to be an update for it, even though we're going to get an updated camera this February. So that's one thing to look out for, but again, I can't obviously keep up with all of these updates and making new videos for each one, but you can always check out markhawkcam.com and just keep up to date with firmware updates and what they offer. And yeah, just wanted to give you guys a sort of support idea on what all these cameras offer and how each of these cameras is sort of kept up by its manufacturers. Anyway, that's going to wrap up our side-by-side with these 3 cameras. This was an incredibly hard comparison to put together. If you found it useful or entertaining in the slightest, please press that like and share button. If you're feeling super supportive, we have the orange link in the lower right. That's our Patreon link. Patreon's a way you can support YouTubers such as myself with a one-time or monthly reoccurring fee. Just helps me keep Mark Hawk Cam going because, again, this was a very expensive and time-consuming project to put together. You can also use a bunch of sort of reference links in the more information section below this video. A lot of that will also go back to Mark Hawk Cam to help support it. But again, if you don't have any money to spare, that's super fine. You can press that like and share button. It helps me out just the same. Anyway, I'm Mark Hawk, and I'll see y'all out there. Have a good one, everyone. Bye. Oh, there's nowhere to go this way. What am I doing?